Hello and thanks for joining me. This is another worm video, and as usual I'm starting my updates with the regular totes. Now with these totes I have been battling a lot of moisture content because it's been pretty humid. And as I'm mixing up the castings in this particular tote, they don't feel too bad on the side that I did not feed the week before. On the side that did get the feeding, it is a little bit wetter, and there was quite a huge worm ball in this one. They were hanging out in the banana. But the level of moisture that I encountered on this side of the bin didn't feel as bad as it had the previous week. So I don't think that I gave it too much food that had a high water content. And the apple, that's what I just placed in the upper right hand corner, they haven't gotten into that. So I'm going to break down that apple. I don't want it to hang around too much longer, as I'm starting to notice potworms in that and beetles. And those are the things that I really don't want to have a lot of in the bins. So I am going to continue to monitor the beetle situation, but give this bin a little bit more of a feeding just to see how it deals with the moisture with the feeding. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, with my worm bins for the regular totes, they do not have holes at the bottom. There's only aeration through the top. So any moisture that I add in, I have to be careful about, as it's not going to evaporate pretty easily if the castings get too heavy. But I just filled this up with a smaller feeding than I would normally give it. And this time I had some cardboard to add to the bin, so I'm going to give it a little bit of cardboard to help soak up that moisture. And then this bin is set up for the next week. Moving over to the second of the regular tote bins that I have. This particular one is the one last week that had a lot more moisture in the bin. So as I go through this one, I am very surprised to see that the side that I didn't feed dried out pretty well. The castings feel really good to the hand, and it looks like the worms have all moved over to the other side where the food is. It has that good hand feel and crumbliness that I look for in my castings. On the side where I fed, there was another large worm ball, which I'm happy to see. It means the worms are getting to the food and they're enjoying themselves. And the moisture wasn't as bad as it had been. It is more wet than the other bin, but not so much that I am concerned that I have too much moisture in the bin. But still, I do want to dig all the way to the bottom to make sure there aren't any clumps that are becoming muddy at the bottom, and there isn't any food either at the bottom of the bin. So I'm just going to take this worm ball and place it on the side that I'm going to feed for the week, and then also give this a smaller feeding than I normally would. I think giving it less food in the summer with high moisture is a little bit better, even though, because this is coming from my garden, I have a lot of melons and summer fruit. The smaller size feedings that I give it allow it not to have too much moisture in the bin. So I did give this some banana and some watermelon. And unlike the last bin, I am going to add cardboard, but I'm only going to put it on the side where I'm feeding it. What I want to see is whether putting cardboard all over is beneficial, or just putting the cardboard in the area where the food was is beneficial. So I'll check to see how the bins look next week, but after adding the cardboard, this sets up this bin for the next week. Moving on to the first of my Vermi bag totes. With these totes, I do keep the bubble wrap on top throughout the whole bin versus just in the area that I feed. as these bins tend to dry out faster because the material is meant for water to evaporate quickly. Even with the material for the Vermibag totes being made to do that, I'm finding that this tote is carrying a lot of moisture, which is really unusual. It's also important to note that if I take the bubble wrap off the top, it's way too crunchy and dry, but it is holding more water than it normally does. I'm not going to do anything about that this week. I'm not going to add any cardboard just yet. I don't know if it's just because I gave it too large of a feeding last week and I should have cut back, but the worms are looking pretty good. I find that they tend to like having a wetter environment than I prefer anyway. So before I jump to doing anything with this bin, I'm just going to give it a normal to small feeding for the size colony that I think is in here, and give it one more week just to see what happens. I'm not going to leave anything uncovered at this time. I'm just going to put the grit on it, cover the food, and then cover the whole bin back up, and then assess it next week and see what I think should be the best course of action with this bin. But this bin really didn't have much of an update for that, so it's all set up for the next week. Jumping on over to the second of the two Vermibag totes. Now this is the bin that I took donor worms from the Vermibag Mini for, and I'm just slow and steady adding material to this bin. I didn't want to take too many worms from the Vermibag Mini and cause that colony to collapse, and I didn't want to just leave the little bit of worms that were left behind from the harvest. So there's a lot less material right now in this bin. But despite that, the worms that are in the castings look happy. It's just that this bin is definitely not going to break down and compost as quickly as the other bins. So I'm going to just give this a small feeding. It's probably a good size feeding for the amount of worms in there. It's not too much, and it is watermelon pieces, so it's going to add some moisture to this. I think I'm going to give this one more week before I add any additional material to it, but I am just trying to grow this colony, so my focus is on just making sure I provide the best environment that the worms are going to like, so that I don't lose this colony again, and it's updated for the next week. And lastly, it is the update for the Vermibag Mini. Now in the Vermibag Mini, my focus with this one is, since I took the worms out, getting any of the worms that are in here to come back to the top, because I took a good chunk of those when I donated them to the Vermibag tote that was a colony collapse basically. So for this one, what I'm trying to do is add a good amount of food to the top to make them come up. But in doing that, as usual, I'm finding that I've got worms at the top and I've got a lot of moisture at the top and in the center, but all around the outside, it's a little crunchy. So it wasn't any different this week. The material along the edges was kind of crispy, a little wetter than what it's usually been, and I noticed that this week all the bins were just a little wetter than they were the previous week, with the exception of the regular totes, but this one didn't have as much of the crispy edges as it normally does, which I was happy to see, and a lot of the worms have come up. But I'm adding more cardboard to this because I want to add more material to this as the level is lowering a lot. And since crispy edges are an issue that I have with the Vermibag Mini, I'm going to wet down all of the cardboard that I'm adding very thoroughly to make sure that it is something that the worms would enjoy and that it doesn't cause the bin to dry out way too much and cause a colony collapse. And then, like I mentioned, I want the worms to come up through the cardboard. So I'm going to give them a hefty feeding this week. A lot of good things like some watermelon chunks, the rind, some banana pieces, but a large feeding to encourage them to move up. And then I'm going to add some more cardboard to the top of this as well and wet that down thoroughly, just to make sure that there's a good layer in here to bring up that material for the bedding and a good place for a majority of the worms to hang out. And then once I've wet this layer down, the bin has been updated for the week. And with that, this will conclude the video. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you so much for watching.